everyone. For those who have been following this channel for some time, you may recall when we went through the Rooster Teeth, I'd hesitate to call it machinima, but definitely fan animation, I guess would be the appropriate term, project known as RWBY, founded by the late Monty Ohm. And while there certainly were biblical themes in the first three volumes, the fourth in particular began to introduce certain themes and elements that were disconcerting to me. They established a dualistic system or a two God theology, an understanding of God in two forms, that there was a good God and an evil God, a creator and a destroyer. And this was essentially a strike one as far as, there isn't as much good and biblical themes that I could discuss from this series. But because I not only loved the series, the characters, but even more importantly, the people who were fans of it, which was myself included at the time, I continued to watch the show and wanted to point out the things that were worthwhile, including perhaps even introduce good discussions concerning the things that weren't worthwhile. That, of course, only escalated in the distortion and picture that was portrayed regarding relationships and character development, and of course, and this was the final straw, regarding how they portrayed Ozpin and the controversy regarding Salem and the idea of life being a curse. That's completely contrary to Scripture, and it's kind of a strike three, you're out. Now, when I made the video describing, and this was, again, not my preferred method of dealing with these sort of things. I want to discuss the positives and the things that point us to the things that are worthwhile in Scripture, to encourage conversations about the deeper biblical themes in these things. And usually if there aren't any, then I just don't say anything. But I wanted to engage with my fellow fans of RWBY and talk to them and engage with them and say, here's why I can't call myself a fan anymore. But encourage further conversation with those who still do, which is why I haven't taken down the videos and studies as they were leading up to Volume 5. But with all that being said as well, there was another detail I've mentioned somewhat in passing on occasional updates that I want to further detail for you, given that the next couple weeks following this video are going to be releasing. During the time in which the two-God system was introduced, I was concerned, as I stated, about the two-God system. But instead of, throwing a fit or complaining about it, I decided to do what any fan on the internet of an anime or animation series would want to do when they find something they want to address, emphasize more, or talk about on a more personal level would do. I wrote a fan fiction. Now, generally, when you hear about fan fictions, you're thinking, oh, so maybe like 10 to 15 pages, if you're really invested in it, portraying conversations or engagements with fictional characters, or portraying other characters within the canon as other than portrayals of which they were shown in the anime. No, my fan fiction spans over 100 pages, and you could consider it a light novel in that regard. I created my own team set in the context and the region known as Vacuo, and I based them all off of biblical names, characters, and themes. And in order to show and engage with the audience that was not only a fan of RWBY, but who shared my heart at the moment I was writing that fan fiction with, exactly why that is a problem. Now, the story that you're going to be seeing released over the next couple weeks, chapter by chapter, is not going to be a pretty one. It is not going to be a tame one, and it is not going to have a happy ending. The whole point of this, and in portraying it as the best I know how, I'm more a speaker than a writer, but I hope to communicate my point as well as I can. Much like with C.S. Lewis and his Chronicles of Narnia series, he found that through the illustrations, through the arts, he could engage with people on an emotional level as well as an intellectual one, which is the whole point as to why I was writing this, and also why I continued to write it even when I could no longer consider myself a fan of RWBY. Believe it or not, I was only about 3/4 of the way through the first half of this book when I basically drew the final straw with RWBY as an animation series, as calling myself a fan. But I continued the book and saw it all the way through to the end for one simple reason, because I'm here to talk with you. Even if I don't necessarily watch RWBY anymore or consider myself a fan of it, I still care about you, all of you, as people, and I want to have conversations with you about the things that we have, or in this case had, in common. And while I certainly do understand that the characters of RWBY and the world that it's set in was a fantastic creation by Monty Ohm, and people have different opinions about where it's gone now and today, I could consider it relevant to the conversation we're having now. I'm going to be going through this book with you, reading it myself. I'll be providing voices for the male and female characters and so forth, and as well be welcoming questions, engagements, or pointing out the development of these characters along the way. And I hope that you're able to understand the three purposes in which I am writing this book. Without any spoilers, we'll certainly have a post-book discussion, but with that being said as well, I want you all to pay very close attention to how the main character wanted to pursue what was right, but what was ultimately his roadblock in the way. Not necessarily because of his nature, but because of the nature of the world that he lived in. Second, when I take the time to address the conflict in motives and interests between the characters and the villains as well, and how they portray themselves, that I'm not equating good and bad, but going to the foundations of why they're called good and bad. And then third, and most importantly, when this series, and I'll spoil it in this regard at least, ends up being a tragedy, I want you to understand that the loss that you're going to be feeling, and hopefully being attached to these characters, and seeing them ultimately meet this horrible end, is not of any fault on their part, but simply the fact that what happens to them and the consolidation that they will ultimately receive in this kind of world is thrown into the hands of two beings that ultimately can't claim the other is wrong, because they're both, by definition, right. When it comes down to it, this is the reason why I caution against this mindset, because too many people fall for a very characterized and, for all intents and purposes, very factually based understanding of what yin and yang actually are. Because while they see the good within evil and the evil at the core of good, that has never been what Hindus, or at least the Eastern thought that founded the concept, Buddhists and so forth, actually mean when they're discussing the nature of the universe. It's not the equation of good and evil or the balance that is present in good and evil. It's acknowledging a flaw as the intention. And that's what I want to ultimately address as not a good thing. Now, I know that there will be people who disagree with me, and I encourage to hear your perspectives, but when it comes to how this story is going to illustrate them, and by the way, the title will note it as well, it's referred to as Team Gold, the acronym for the names of the characters, Gideon, Olivia, Leia, which will be the abbreviation of her name, Havaliah, and Daniel, will all be characters that are based on the inspirations of their name, and hopefully give you a very hands-on, a very well-paced, and a very well-developed portrayal of what are the ultimate consequences of living in a dualistic world, meaning that where you have a good God and an evil God, two beings that can both claim the right to be the standard for what's right. And if someone chooses to follow one over the other, well, then frankly, the people that choose to follow the opposite are just as right and just as wrong as the other. And this is not how morality works. And so, leaving that ultimately an end to a tragedy, I encourage you still to listen to it and hopefully be able to engage with you on these things, and maybe even encourage future endeavors. I am still writing some light-hearted side stories and short quips between the two of them that will celebrate their personalities. You can call it a Team Gold chibi, if you will, that we may or may not be able to address after this. I have friends who are very talented in voice acting and effects editing. We might be able to dramatize this afterwards as well. But I first want to see your reaction and hope to engage with you all regarding the nature of this dualistic system illustrated through my fan fiction of RWBY. That will, of course, be known as Team Gold. So I'll look forward to releasing this all with you, and we'll be happy to receive your questions in the meantime. Just a note as well, I have formatted the world in which RWBY is functioning with volumes 1 through 3 in mind, not necessarily taking any material or inspiration from volumes 4 and onward because they didn't exist when I was writing this. It's been out for a while, but I've been waiting for the right time to release it, and I hope that this will be one for you as well. So if there's any conflicts in canon or all the Grimm don't necessarily function in that way or that's been changed, I didn't know that at the time. But I'll look forward to getting your feedback. I'll look forward to engaging with you on all of these things, and I look forward to having the opportunity to engage with you, fans of RWBY, fellows, or otherwise, on this topic. If you're a fan of fan fictions, I'll look forward to perhaps even hearing about some of your own and hopefully even inspiring some of you to write with and engage with our fan base on these very issues, or perhaps issues that you yourself are passionate and informed about. And in order to engage with your fans, you meet them on their terms as well. I look forward to doing the same with all of you. I want to thank you all for your time in listening to this quick update, and I'll look forward to hearing what you have to say as we release this fan fiction chapter by chapter over the next following weeks. God bless you, and I'll look forward to seeing you all then.